If the Bible quotes it, why isn't it in the Bible? The Book of Enoch is one of the most mysterious texts in ancient history, quoted directly by Jude in the New Testament, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and widely read by early Christians. Yet today, it's considered forbidden, removed, buried beneath centuries of silence. Why? What was so dangerous about this book that early councils rejected it, theologians avoided it, and modern churches won't even talk about it? The answer begins in Genesis 6, with the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim, a passage so cryptic that most pastors skip over it. But Enoch didn't skip it, he expanded it. He told the story behind the story, of angels who fell, of a pact made in rebellion, and of giants born from heaven and earth. It's a narrative so strange, so otherworldly, that it almost feels like fiction. But the Bible confirms it. Jude quotes Enoch's prophecy word for word. Peter speaks of the angels in chains, and Jesus himself alludes to the days of Noah, a time marked not just by sin, but by something unnatural. Enoch doesn't contradict the Bible, it fills in the shadows. So why remove it? Why silence a book that early believers considered holy? What secrets does it hold? And why were we told to forget them? The answers are older than most know, and darker than many are ready for. Where are you from? Mention in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Before the flood, before Moses, even before Abraham, there was a man named Enoch who walked so closely with God that he never died. Genesis 5:24 says, "Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." But that one line hides a greater mystery, because according to the Book of Enoch, before God took him, Enoch saw something so terrifying it shook the heavens. He saw angels fall, not metaphorically, literally. They descended to earth, led by a being named Semyaza, and made a pact on Mount Hermon, 200 of them, bound by oath. Their mission, to corrupt creation. They took human women and created offspring known as the Nephilim, giants of violence and hunger. But that wasn't all. These fallen watchers taught humanity forbidden knowledge, how to make weapons of war, how to manipulate nature, how to use magic, astrology, cosmetics, seduction, root-cutting, and sorcery. What they gave us wasn't wisdom, it was corruption. Civilization accelerated, but so did sin, and heaven took notice. Enoch was sent as a scribe, a messenger between realms, to deliver the verdict from God. Judgment was coming. The angels begged Enoch to intercede, to plead for mercy, but there would be none. Their children would be destroyed, their bodies bound in darkness, and their story buried beneath flood and time. So why would modern readers be kept from this book? Because Enoch didn't just describe history, he uncovered a war, one that still rages, one that begins with knowledge. Genesis 6:4 says, "There were giants in the earth in those days, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men." For centuries, scholars have wrestled with who these sons of God really were. Were they fallen angels, or just powerful men? The Book of Enoch doesn't leave it vague. It names them, it records their rebellion, it describes their offspring, not in vague poetic terms, but in graphic detail. The Nephilim were not just tall humans, they were monstrous hybrids, enormous in size, violent in nature, and insatiable in appetite. Enoch says they devoured everything humans produced, and when food ran out, they turned to flesh. Human flesh. The earth cried out under the weight of their sin. Blood soaked the soil, and humanity teetered on the edge of extinction. These giants weren't just a threat to mankind. They were a contamination of creation itself, a breach between the spiritual and physical realms. And that's why God acted. The flood wasn't just about sin, it was about preservation. The human bloodline had to be cleansed. Noah wasn't just righteous, he was uncorrupted, pure, and through him, God restarted humanity. But if that's true, why did giants appear again later? Why did Israel face them in Canaan? Why did Goliath walk centuries after the flood? Enoch hints that the spirits of the giants, once killed, became what we now call demons, and their influence never left. The world cleansed by water still echoes with their whispers. Because evil doesn't drown, it waits. It wasn't just their offspring that corrupted the world, it was their knowledge. According to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers didn't simply lust after women, they weaponized wisdom. They taught secrets God never intended for man to know. Semyaza and his fallen brothers introduced forbidden arts, enchantments, weapon forging, sorcery, root cutting, astrology, and the manipulation of creation itself. One angel taught the making of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, long before war had scarred the world. Another revealed how to read stars and control time. Another instructed women in seduction, adorning the eyes, beautifying the face, and turning desire into dominion. These weren't just cultural innovations, they were spiritual violations. Gifts meant to enslave, knowledge meant to dominate. The result was a world spiraling into darkness, sin accelerating faster than human conscience could contain. It was not natural rebellion, it was taught rebellion. Systems of corruption passed down by beings who once stood in the presence of God. And Enoch was the witness. He was taken through the heavens, shown the prisons where the angels would be chained, and warned of the judgment that would consume both them and the world they infected. What they taught was hidden after the flood, buried in fragments of memory, rebranded as myths and magic. But the roots remain. Today we call them ancient civilizations, but Enoch calls them something else, evidence. Evidence that heaven was breached, that evil was instructed, and that the sins we call modern were never ours to begin with. The Book of Enoch wasn't written in secret. It was cherished, copied, and passed down for centuries. Early Jewish communities read it. The Essenes of Qumran stored it in their sacred scrolls. The early church fathers, like Tertullian and Irenaeus, referenced it openly. Even Jude, the brother of Jesus, quoted it word for word in the New Testament. "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones." That line doesn't exist anywhere in the Old Testament. It's from Enoch 1:9. So why would the Bible quote a book that the church later removed? The answer lies in fear. Not fear of fantasy, but fear of implication. Because if Enoch is true, then the Genesis 6 account isn't just symbolic, it's literal. Fallen angels really did breed with humans. Giants really did walk the earth. Forbidden knowledge really did warp civilization. And behind it all was a war between realms. That kind of truth shatters the sanitized version of Scripture most institutions are comfortable teaching. By the 4th century, councils began drawing hard lines. Only 66 books would remain. Enoch was labeled non-canonical, not because it contradicted Scripture, but because it made Scripture too real, too strange, too uncomfortable, and so it was silenced. But it never vanished. Ethiopia preserved it. Fragments survived. And now it's resurfacing. In a world that looks eerily like the one it described, the Watchers are gone, but their influence lingers. And maybe that's why Enoch was hidden, not because it was false, but because it was too true. When Jesus described the end of the world, he didn't reference kings or plagues first. He said it would be as it was in the days of Noah. Most assume that means people will be sinful, distracted, unprepared. But what if Jesus was pointing to something deeper? In the days of Noah, sin wasn't just human, it was hybrid. The world wasn't just wicked, it was corrupted by the unnatural. Genesis 6 doesn't describe normal rebellion. It speaks of divine beings, the sons of God, crossing boundaries. It speaks of giants, of fallen angels. And in that context, Jesus warns that the end will be the same. A return to Noah's world, a return to Enoch's vision. He didn't say the name, but he didn't have to. The audience knew the story. The Book of Enoch was still circulating in Jewish thought. The Nephilim, the Watchers, the flood judgment. It was part of their framework. And when Jesus said the last days would echo that time, it wasn't just about violence or distraction. It was about infiltration. The supernatural violating the natural, the spiritual corrupting the flesh. And now, with technology surpassing biology, with mankind chasing godlike control over creation, we are again approaching the boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. Just like Enoch saw, just like Jesus warned. And maybe the reason he left Enoch unnamed was to test whether we would recognize the patterns, not by title, but by truth. The Book of Enoch says the rebellious angels, the Watchers, were sentenced by God to be bound beneath the earth, imprisoned in darkness until the day of judgment. Jude 6 echoes this. And the angels which kept not their first estate, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness. But here's the mystery. If all the Watchers were chained, why does evil still whisper with such power? Why do people claim to encounter dark entities, spiritual visitations, and ancient knowledge today? Some scholars believe not all were imprisoned, that the leaders, like Semyaza and Azazel, were judged immediately, while others remained active, continuing to influence humanity in quieter, more strategic ways. Enoch says that Azazel taught mankind to make weapons and was blamed for much of the earth's corruption, so he was cast into a desert covered with sharp stones until the final fire. But the spirits of the giants, their hybrid offspring, weren't imprisoned. When their bodies died in the flood, their spirits roamed the earth, thirsty, angry, disembodied. And those spirits, Enoch says, became demons. Not fallen angels, but children of forbidden union, cursed to wander. That's why they crave bodies. That's why they seek possession. They are rootless, restless, and rejected, forever between realms. And perhaps that's the darkest truth. The flood washed the world, but it didn't end the war. Because the Watchers may be chained, but their legacy still moves. In shadows, in systems, and sometimes in us. For centuries, the Church has taught that demons are fallen angels, rebels who followed Lucifer in his prideful descent. But the Book of Enoch paints a far more disturbing picture. It says demons are not angels at all. They are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, the giants born from the union of heavenly beings and human women. When those giants were destroyed in the flood, their bodies perished, but their spirits did not. Enoch calls them evil spirits of the earth, cursed to wander, causing trouble, hunger, deception, and violence. They were never meant to exist, not fully divine, not fully human, and now they roam in torment, feeding on what they can no longer feel. That's why they crave possession. They aren't fallen royalty. They're orphaned monsters, children of rebellion, looking for a host. This changes everything. It means demons aren't just ancient spirits. They're reminders of a forbidden union, of a time when angels crossed a line God never intended to be crossed. It also explains their hatred. They weren't created by God. They were rejected by Him. And they envy us, because we were made in His image, loved, and offered redemption. But they have none. Their fate is sealed. Their end is fire. And until then, they corrupt what they can, whisper where they may, and wait for open doors. Not because they have power, but because they were born from it, and never found peace. And that makes them desperate. In modern science, stars are burning balls of gas, distant, impersonal, and lifeless. But in the Book of Enoch, stars are not just objects, they are entities, living, moving, accountable beings. Enoch says some stars transgressed their appointed courses and were punished for it. He describes a place of burning fire and imprisonment, not for men, but for stars that rebelled. At first, this sounds like myth, until you remember that Revelation 1:20 calls angels stars. that Job 38:7 says the morning stars sang together when the foundations of the world were laid. And suddenly, Enoch's vision doesn't seem like fantasy, it seems prophetic. What if stars, in some spiritual dimension, are more than matter? What if they're symbols of heavenly beings, some loyal, some fallen? Enoch walked through multiple heavens, guided by angels, and saw the order of creation from the top down. He watched the courses of the luminaries, the sun, the moon, the stars, and recorded their obedience and their rebellion. Those who crossed their appointed lines were bound in darkness, waiting judgment. It wasn't about light, it was about loyalty. The heavens to Enoch were not cold and mechanical, they were alive. And the universe itself testified, not just to design, but to decision. Some stars chose to rebel, some stayed loyal, and their fates were sealed. It's a perspective lost in modern thinking, but woven into Scripture's oldest poetry. The sky isn't empty, it's watching, and some of it has fallen. Long before John saw the throne room in Revelation, before Isaiah trembled at the sight of God's robe, before Paul was caught up to the third heaven, Enoch walked into realms no man had seen, not in death, but in life. Genesis 5 says God took him, but the Book of Enoch describes what that meant. Enoch was escorted by holy angels into multiple levels of heaven. He passed through gates of fire, into chambers of light, into places where winds were stored, stars were measured, judgments were declared. He saw the tree of life, glowing with 7 fragrances. He saw the angelic scribes who recorded the deeds of men. He saw the face of the Ancient of Days, and lived. This wasn't a dream. It was a journey. And what he brought back wasn't poetry. It was warning. Enoch saw the plan of God laid out like a scroll. The rise and fall of empires, the judgment of angels, the coming of a Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and the lake of fire that awaited all rebellion, angelic or human. That's why his book reads with such clarity. It's not speculation, it's testimony, and that's what makes it so dangerous. Because if Enoch really saw heaven before the flood, then the warnings he delivered are older than the law, older than the prophets, older than Moses himself. They are not optional stories. They are a record of what's coming, and if he walked with God and never died, maybe we should listen. In the Book of Enoch, among all the fallen watchers, one name is singled out with terrifying emphasis: Azazel. While Semyaza led the descent of angels, it was Azazel who taught men to kill. He showed them how to craft swords, forge knives, manipulate metals, and shed blood. He introduced war into a world that had never seen it. But his influence didn't stop with violence. He unveiled secrets of vanity and deception, bracelets, cosmetics, dyes, enchantments. The kind of beauty that hides corruption, the kind of power that seduces instead of protects. Enoch writes that the whole earth was corrupted through the works of Azazel, and that all sin was attributed to him. His punishment was unlike any other, bound hand and foot, cast into a deep pit in the wilderness called Dudael, covered in jagged stones and held there until the day of judgment. It was brutal, final, and deserved. But here's the deeper shock. In the biblical Day of Atonement ritual described in Leviticus 16, one goat was sacrificed to the Lord, and another, the scapegoat, was sent into the wilderness to Azazel. The very name shows up, tied to sin and exile. Some scholars claim it was just a remote place, but others wonder, was the ritual pointing back to the same fallen being condemned by Enoch? Was Azazel not just a myth, but a real figure who once corrupted the world and still echoes in our ceremonies? If so, then the scapegoat didn't just carry sin away, it carried it back to its origin. When we think of the flood, we imagine God judging the wickedness of mankind, and he did. Genesis 6:5 says, "Every intent of the human heart was only evil continually." But the Book of Enoch adds another layer, one that shifts the entire narrative. The flood wasn't just divine judgment on humans. It was a cosmic reset, a purge of hybrid bloodlines, a cleansing of Earth's genetic corruption. Enoch describes how the Watchers, after descending to Earth and fathering giants, cried out in desperation when judgment was declared. They begged Enoch to intercede, to ask God for mercy. He did, and the answer was final: no. Their offspring would be destroyed. Their presence would be erased. The flood wasn't a natural disaster. It was a divine execution. Enoch says the giants turned against each other. War broke out between them. The earth groaned under their weight. Blood flowed without end. And when the waters came, it was not just to drown. It was to bury an infection, an unnatural line. The flood silenced not just rebellion, but a rebellion that began in heaven and took root in the flesh of man. That's why Noah is described as perfect in his generations, not just righteous, but untainted. His lineage had not been touched by the Watchers. Through him, God would preserve what was pure. The world after the flood was quieter, but not empty of threat, because though the bodies of giants were gone, their spirits, their demons, remained. If the flood wiped out the Nephilim, why do we still see giants in the Bible after Noah's Ark touched down? Why did Israel face terrifying figures like Og of Bashan, whose bed measured over 13 feet? Why did Goliath and his towering brothers appear generations later, mocking God's people? Enoch doesn't answer this directly, but his writings raise a haunting possibility. The original giants were destroyed, but their spirits remained, restless, violent, unclean. These spirits, according to Enoch, became demons, wandering the earth in search of influence, flesh, and access. Some scholars suggest that the Watchers who weren't fully punished found new ways to infect mankind after the flood, not through direct physical union, but through subtle spiritual manipulation, through possession, through teaching, through the reintroduction of forbidden knowledge, and perhaps through those doors, the corruption resumed. Genesis 6:4 says, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also afterward." That phrase, "and also afterward," is not accidental. It signals something continued, something survived, not in body, but in spirit. And if spirits can influence bloodlines, deceive hearts, and manipulate nations, then it's possible that the giants of post-flood history weren't accidents. They were echoes, new versions of an old rebellion, reboots of what the flood tried to erase. And perhaps that's why God commanded Israel not just to fight some tribes, but to utterly destroy them. Because some battles weren't just about land, they were about bloodlines, and the shadows hiding within them. When Israel entered the Promised Land, God didn't just instruct them to conquer cities, He commanded them to completely destroy certain groups. No survivors, no compromise. Entire nations wiped out. Critics call it genocide. But the Book of Enoch and Genesis 6 hint at something far more complex. What if these weren't just normal tribes? What if some of them carried remnants of Nephilim blood? The Bible names them, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Zamzumim, all tribes of giants. Deuteronomy 2:20 calls them a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. Joshua's spies trembled before them, saying, "We were like grasshoppers in their sight." These weren't metaphors. These were genetic echoes of a forbidden past. And if Enoch is right, these giants weren't born of random mutation. They were born of ancient corruption. Traces of the Watchers' rebellion still pulsing through generations. And that's why God's command was so severe. Not because He hated people, but because He was preserving His promise. The Messiah could not come through a bloodline tainted by angels. The seed of the woman, not of the serpent, that would crush evil's head. And so the giants had to fall, not just for justice, but for redemption. Every battle in Canaan wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, a war to cleanse the land for something holy. And when David struck Goliath, he wasn't just defeating a Philistine, He was ending a legacy that began on Mount Hermon, when angels fell and giants rose. David was just a shepherd with a sling, facing a warrior over 9 feet tall. But what if the battle between David and Goliath was more than just underdog versus giant? What if it was the final confrontation between God's chosen bloodline and the last living trace of the Nephilim? Goliath wasn't an isolated freak of nature. 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles reveal he had brothers, other giants, born of the same lineage in Gath. These weren't average men. They had extra fingers and toes, towering size, weapons so heavy they required superhuman strength, and they all fell at the hands of David and his men. It wasn't just personal victory, it was prophecy in action. God used David to finish what the flood began, the extermination of a corrupted line. Goliath mocked the armies of the living God, unaware that he was standing as the final echo of a rebellion that started before the flood waters ever rose. And David's stone, guided not by skill but by purpose, shattered more than a forehead. It broke a spiritual chain. After Goliath and his kin were defeated, the Bible never again speaks of giants as physical threats. They fade from the narrative. The bloodline ends. The stage is cleared for the coming of the Messiah. And yet, their spirits remained. The Nephilim may have died in flesh, but their hatred lives on in the demonic realm. David won the battle, but the war between realms, that still continues. The Book of Enoch doesn't just speak of the past. It reaches forward into the future with unsettling clarity. While many ancient texts are vague, poetic, or metaphorical, Enoch's vision of the end is disturbingly specific. He sees the return of heavenly judgment. He describes a time when secret knowledge rises again, when the influence of fallen powers re-emerges on the earth, and when people align with darkness in the name of progress. He says sinners will rewrite truth, the righteous will be silenced, and the proud will build great kingdoms that collapse in fire. He even describes a final figure, a ruler of deception, who leads many astray under the disguise of peace. It sounds eerily like the Antichrist. But Enoch doesn't just leave it at destruction. He speaks of the return of the elect one, a figure sent by God, who sits on a throne of glory, separates the wicked from the just, and rules in eternal light. This elect one comes with 10,000 holy ones, echoing the exact phrase Jude uses in the New Testament. And the climax is not chaos, it's judgment. The fallen angels are cast into fire, the corrupt are erased, the righteous are restored, and the earth is made new. If Enoch saw all of this before the flood, then his visions weren't fantasy. They were time travel, a glimpse into the very end. And maybe that's why the book was buried, not because it was false, but because it revealed too much truth, too soon. In the first few centuries after Christ, the Book of Enoch wasn't obscure. It was revered. The early church didn't see it as heresy. They quoted it. They studied it. They copied it. Church fathers like Tertullian, Athenagoras, and Clement of Alexandria referenced Enoch in their writings, treating it as a legitimate source of divine insight. Even more shocking, the Epistle of Jude, written by the brother of Jesus, directly quotes Enoch 1:9, not as a myth, but as prophecy. For Jude, Enoch was scripture. So what changed? As the centuries passed, the church became more organized, more political, more careful about which writings were allowed to shape doctrine. Councils were formed. Canons were closed. And books that raised uncomfortable questions about angels mating with women, giants walking the earth, and supernatural forces influencing nations were pushed aside. Not because they were disproven, but because they were disruptive. Enoch didn't fit the sanitized theology the church was building. It was too raw, too cosmic, too real. So it was buried, lost to the West, but not to everyone. In Ethiopia, where Christianity spread early and took root deeply, Enoch remained sacred. It was preserved in the Ge'ez language, guarded by monks, read alongside Genesis. While the rest of the world forgot, Ethiopia remembered. And today, fragments of Enoch are being rediscovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient copies older than the New Testament itself. The question isn't whether Enoch is dangerous. It's this: why was the early church allowed to read it, but you weren't? For centuries, skeptics dismissed the Book of Enoch as legend, a mystical forgery from the fringes of belief. Western scholars said it had no historical weight, no ancient credibility, and no place in serious theology. But then came 1947, a moment that rewrote everything. In the caves of Qumran, near the Dead Sea, a shepherd stumbled upon clay jars holding some of the oldest biblical manuscripts ever found. Among them were fragments of nearly every book of the Old Testament. But hidden in those scrolls was Enoch. In fact, it was one of the most commonly preserved texts. Multiple copies, different translations, revered by the Essenes, a Jewish sect obsessed with purity, prophecy, and the end of days. They didn't treat Enoch as myth, they treated it as scripture. And these copies of Enoch weren't medieval fabrications, they were over 2,000 years old. Older than most New Testament writings, preserved in the same desert where John the Baptist would later preach. This discovery shattered the narrative that Enoch was a Christian-era invention. It wasn't. It was pre-Christian, deeply Jewish, and respected by communities awaiting the Messiah. And suddenly, the silence surrounding Enoch didn't look like coincidence. It looked intentional. If Enoch was valued by those preparing for the end times, if it shaped how they saw angels, judgment, and the coming of God's kingdom, then its removal wasn't theological housekeeping, it was erasure. But scrolls don't stay buried forever. And now that Enoch has resurfaced, so has the question the church once feared. What if it was true all along? Centuries before Jesus walked the earth, the Book of Enoch described someone called the Elect One, the Son of Man, and the Righteous One. These weren't vague messianic hopes. They were vivid, exact, and unapologetically divine. Enoch saw this figure seated on a throne of glory, judging the kings of the earth, casting out the wicked, and standing beside the Ancient of Days, not as a servant, but as an equal. He would be revealed to the righteous, hidden from the world until the appointed time, and then exalted forever. Sound familiar? It should. Jesus repeatedly called himself the Son of Man, a phrase he pulled not just from Daniel, but one echoed throughout Enoch's pages. This Son of Man in Enoch is pre-existent, chosen before creation, and destined to judge both angels and men. That's not a Jewish revolutionary, that's a cosmic redeemer. Which raises the uncomfortable question: how did a book written before Christ so perfectly describe him? Some argue Christians retrofitted the language, but the Dead Sea Scrolls prove Enoch's messianic titles predate Jesus. Others claim it was symbolic, not prophetic, but the details cut too close. Enoch's Messiah isn't just a good man. He's eternal, powerful, and terrifying to the wicked. And maybe that's why the book was silenced, not because it failed to align with Christian theology, but because it aligned too well, too early, too clearly. In Enoch, the Messiah doesn't emerge in mystery. He arrives with fire, and for some, that was too much truth, too soon. The Book of Enoch doesn't shy away from the end. It doesn't soften the language, round the edges, or comfort the reader. Instead, it unfolds a vision of the final judgment so clear, so thunderous, that it echoes the very tone of Revelation. Enoch sees the throne set in place, the books opened, the Ancient of Days taking his seat. But what terrifies most is not the fire, it's the justice. Enoch says nothing is hidden. Every secret word, every silent thought, every unspoken motive is laid bare, not just for humans, but for angels. The rebellious watchers are dragged into judgment. The Nephilim are condemned. the demons are silenced, and the souls of the righteous are vindicated. Enoch says they waited, under the earth crying out, until this very day, their blood not forgotten, their pain not erased. And then the elect one comes, not as a teacher, not as a sacrifice, but as a judge. He separates the nations. He restores the just. He removes the wicked like smoke from the sky. The mountains melt, the stars fall, and the earth, once corrupted, is made new. It's not symbolic, it's specific. And that's what makes it so dangerous to those who want a more comfortable theology. Enoch doesn't leave room for neutral ground. You are either aligned with the kingdom of God or part of the rebellion that began long before Noah built his ark. The judgment Enoch saw is coming, and when it does, there will be no more time to wonder why his book was hidden. There's a mountain in the Bible that most readers pass by, Mount Hermon. But in the Book of Enoch, this mountain is ground zero for the greatest rebellion in spiritual history. It was here, Enoch says, that 200 angels descended in secret. Led by Semyaza, they bound themselves with an oath, swearing never to abandon their plan. Their mission wasn't worship, it was invasion. These watchers didn't come to observe, they came to possess. They took human wives, birthed unnatural offspring, and unleashed forbidden knowledge into the world. And it all began on Hermon. The name itself comes from the Hebrew herem, meaning curse. And that curse didn't stay local, it spread. The giants that came from this pact devoured the land. The spirits that emerged from their corpses became the demons of every civilization, and the judgment that followed, the flood, was not just an act of cleansing. It was a divine reset from a spiritual infection that started with an oath. But here's the twist. In the New Testament, Jesus brings his disciples to the region of Caesarea Philippi, at the base of Mount Hermon. And it's there, standing before this cursed peak, that he asks, "Who do you say I am?" It's no coincidence. Jesus was standing on the very soil where angels once fell, declaring war in the opposite direction. Not rebellion from heaven, but restoration to it. Mount Hermon was the place where heaven fell, and Christ chose it to reveal the one who would rise. In the Book of Enoch, the watchers didn't just corrupt through lust, they corrupted through knowledge. Azazel taught men the art of weapon making, others taught enchantments, astrology, root cutting, charms, and sorcery. This wasn't wisdom from God, it was sacred knowledge twisted into power. And the result wasn't enlightenment, it was destruction. The earth groaned, the heavens wept, and judgment came. But what if that same knowledge is resurfacing today, not as magic spells or ancient rituals, but as science divorced from morality, as truth stripped of holiness? The Watchers gave mankind technology without restraint, beauty without purity, and influence without humility. They gave gifts too great for fallen hands. And now, in our world, where artificial intelligence rewrites identity, where spiritual practices are merged with self-worship, where the stars are read but not feared, the pattern is back. Knowledge is rising, but so is deception. Paul warned that in the last days people would heap up teachers to say what their itching ears wanted to hear. They would reject sound doctrine for myths. And Enoch already told us what kind of myths would return, the ones first whispered by angels who should have stayed in heaven. The line between truth and lie is thin now, and some of the loudest voices wear the softest faces. But the spirit behind them, it's ancient, and it's familiar. Because the Watchers may be bound, but their teachings, they've never truly left. They just changed form, and they still reach for minds willing to listen. The New Testament overflows with stories of Jesus confronting demons. But these encounters were not mild. They were violent, trembling, and filled with screams. The demons didn't question his power. They begged for mercy. "Have you come to torment us before the time?" they asked. It was as if they knew exactly who he was and exactly what he came to do. According to the Book of Enoch, demons are not fallen angels. They are the spirits of the Nephilim, the hybrid offspring of heaven and earth. Their bodies perished in the flood, but their spirits were cursed to roam, hungry, bitter, and incomplete. And when Jesus appeared, walking in flesh, yet carrying divine authority, they panicked. His presence was a death sentence. These spirits were never part of God's original creation. They were born from rebellion. There was no redemption offered to them, no covenant, no cross, only judgment. And they knew it. That's why they begged to enter pigs. That's why they screamed in torment. Not because Jesus was just another exorcist, but because he was the Son of the One who sentenced their fathers to darkness. Every time Jesus cast out a demon, it wasn't just healing, it was war. A declaration that their rule was ending, that their roaming was nearly over, and that the same power that drowned the Nephilim had now put on flesh. The children of the Watchers had survived the flood, but they couldn't survive the Word made flesh. When Jesus described the end times in Matthew 24, he didn't compare them to plagues or famines. He said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man." For most, that means sin, violence, and spiritual blindness. But the Book of Enoch offers a deeper layer. In Noah's day, the world wasn't just wicked, it was infiltrated. Angels walked among men, giants ruled cities, hybrid bloodlines corrupted the image of God, secret knowledge twisted creation, and justice from heaven was the only remedy. What if Jesus was warning not just of moral decay, but of a return to something unnatural, a resurgence of the forbidden? Today, technology pushes into godlike realms. Genetic editing, artificial intelligence, merging man with machine, all echo the ancient sin of crossing boundaries. Spiritual deception grows bolder, New Age teachings mask the old lies. And the longing to ascend, to become more than human, grows louder. Enoch said the Watchers taught mankind how to manipulate creation, and now, in the name of progress, we do it again, not under stars, but in laboratories, not with sorcery, but with science. And just like before, the warning signs are ignored. Marrying, eating, building, unaware that judgment stands at the door. The days of Noah weren't just ancient history, they were prophecy. A shadow of the end. And if we're truly returning to that time, then the ark won't be made of wood. It'll be made of faith, and few will enter. From Sumerian tablets to Aztec pyramids, from Egyptian tombs to Hindu epics, nearly every ancient civilization shares one eerie theme: beings from the sky descending to earth, bringing knowledge, power, and judgment. They're called gods. Star people, shining ones. Some come in chariots of fire, others with wings or glowing garments. But always, they arrive from above, and always, they change the course of humanity. Mainstream historians chalk it up to myth. But what if it's memory? What if all these cultures are echoing the same event, the descent of the Watchers, just as the Book of Enoch described? 200 angels landing on Mount Hermon, teaching mankind what should have never been known. Enoch names them, lists their crimes, records the consequences. And if these events happened early in human history, before the scattering at Babel, then every nation that followed would have carried pieces of the same story. Distorted, yes, but rooted in truth. That's why pyramids rise on opposite ends of the world. That's why divine beings are pictured with animal faces, giant stature, or heavenly fire. They're fragments fossils of a spiritual invasion, and modern minds dismiss them too easily, because to accept them means admitting Enoch might be right, that the gods weren't gods, they were fallen angels, that the knowledge we revere was seeded by rebellion, and that humanity's golden age wasn't progress, it was corruption. The world remembers, but not clearly. Only Enoch names the ones who came, and the price we paid for their gifts. The Bible tells us Satan is a liar, a deceiver, a tempter, but the Book of Enoch suggests something more dangerous, that Satan's true power isn't just in lies, but in disclosure, not hiding information, but leaking it. The Watchers, who rebelled, didn't come with violence. They came with gifts. They taught humans to write with ink and parchment, to work metal, to craft weapons, to read the stars, to paint their faces, to charm their enemies. And slowly they made knowledge a tool of rebellion. That's Satan's strategy, to twist what's sacred. Enoch exposes it with unsettling clarity. Evil doesn't always storm through the door. Sometimes it teaches. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it builds civilizations on cursed foundations. And by the time you realize what's happening, the flood is the only way out. Enoch saw the pattern. He saw how secret knowledge created pride, how pride invited corruption, and how corruption demanded judgment. But that insight, that Satan advances through enlightenment, not just darkness, is what makes Enoch's book so threatening. It unmasks the strategy long before it repeats. It shows us that not all progress is pure, that not every teacher is holy, that not all light comes from heaven. The modern world idolizes knowledge, but Enoch knew the first fall wasn't because man was weak. It was because angels shared what God had forbidden. The serpent whispered truth with a hook, and humanity swallowed it whole. That's not just ancient history. That's tomorrow. For nearly 2,000 years, the Book of Enoch was hidden, lost to the West, preserved only in the highlands of Ethiopia and whispered about by a few curious scholars. But now, in a generation filled with deception, curiosity, and spiritual hunger, it's back, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, translated into dozens of languages, read by millions who sense that something about this ancient text was never meant to stay buried. And the timing is no accident. Enoch prophesied of the end, not just of the world, but of secrets. He said that his writings were for a remote generation, one that would understand what others could not. He saw a time when evil would grow bold, when fallen knowledge would rise again, and when truth would become rare. That time is now. We live in an age of surveillance, cloning, spiritual syncretism, and confusion, and just as in Noah's day, men are calling evil good and good evil. But God never lets darkness go unchallenged. When deception rises, so does revelation. And maybe, just maybe, the rediscovery of Enoch is part of that response. A trumpet from the ancient past warning us not to repeat history, not to trust every teacher, not to confuse progress with purity, because the same spirits that descended on Mount Hermon are still whispering, still teaching, still corrupting. And Enoch's voice, once silenced, now speaks again, not to scare us, but to prepare us. Because the flood isn't coming this time. Fire is. For centuries, pastors preached the gospel without ever mentioning Enoch. Seminaries trained generations of ministers while skipping one of the most explosive books tied to both Genesis and Revelation. But was this silence just oversight or prophecy unfolding? Enoch himself says that his writings were sealed, not for his generation, not for the flood survivors, not even for Israel's kings, but for those who live in the time of tribulation. He knew the world wasn't ready. that the truths inside would only be understood when the world returned to the days of Noah, when watchers in the skies became a global obsession, when science tampered with life itself, when demons were rebranded as trauma and spiritual battles were treated like metaphors. Enoch's time is now, but most pulpits remain quiet. Why? Because his book doesn't fit the polished comfort of modern religion. It's not seeker-friendly. It doesn't flatter the crowds. It calls out fallen angels by name. It speaks of judgment not just for humans, but for heaven's rebels. It demands holiness in a world addicted to compromise. And maybe that's why it was removed. Not because it confused people, but because it exposed too much. But now, in a generation where silence is no longer an option, the book reemerges, not to rewrite scripture but to fulfill it, to echo what Jude quoted, to reveal what Jesus warned, and to call the final remnant to open their eyes before the scrolls are no longer read but lived. He was the man who walked with God, and then was no more, for God took him. Enoch never died. He never tasted the grave. He bypassed the curse that all others inherited. Why? Because he pleased God, and the book that bears his name is no different. For generations, it vanished, like the man himself. But now, like Enoch returning from silence, the book has come back, carrying secrets that explain the chaos of our world. It's not a book about conspiracy. It's a warning about corruption. It's not a replacement for the Bible. It's a lens that makes certain scriptures clearer, more urgent. Enoch speaks of watchers, of giants, of fallen stars and sealed judgments. But above all, it speaks of the Holy One, the righteous judge who sees everything, remembers everyone, and misses nothing. It reminds us that the rebellion that began in Genesis still rages, that spiritual battles are real, that deception wears a crown and often speaks from pulpits. But it also reminds us that God is not silent. He still sends messengers. He still opens scrolls. He still prepares arks, not of wood, but of faith. And maybe, just maybe, the reason Enoch was hidden for so long was because it was never meant for them. It was meant for you, for now, for this moment in history, when ancient truths must rise to meet ancient lies, and the ones who have ears to hear must decide which voice they follow before the sky splits and the judge returns, not in silence, but in fire.